Kia ora boys, and today we're going to have a quick look through food chains and food webs, and particularly the differences and similarities between the two. So, what are food chains and food webs? Well, a picture tells a million words, so here is a typical food chain. Food chains are always a single group of organisms that link in terms of feeding on one another or passing their energy from one to another. What do I mean by this? Well, food chains will always start with a producer. This is a word we will get to know very well in this topic, and producers are anything that can photosynthesize, okay, such as grass. We'll then see a series of organisms, from the grasshopper to the mouse to the owl, and all of these will feed on the previous organism. The reason the arrows are pointing this way is because the grass is transferring its energy to the grasshopper when the grasshopper eats it. Okay, it doesn't mean that the grass eats the grasshopper. Very common misconception. Okay, so a food chain is like a chain, all right? The links in the chain, one after the other, okay, in a long line, are the organisms. Okay, and it will always finish with the top predator. So what is a food web? Well, if a chain is a big long line, then a web is a bit more complicated. So imagine a spider's web, okay? Lots of different organisms here that are all linked together, okay? Depending on who feeds on what, where the energy is being transferred. So we'll get onto this in a little bit more detail later on, but don't panic, they don't all look this complicated. But just remember, a food web is lots of organisms found in an ecosystem, okay, and it's showing all the directions that the energy is flowing, originally from the sun. So, food chains, a little bit more detail here, and some new vocabulary for you guys to learn. So, in a food chain, we're talking about a few different things. We're talking about the trophic levels, okay, and that's the levels in which the organisms occupy. Feeding strategies, and these words will be quite familiar to you. You would have heard them before. And I've got two examples here, a decomposer food chain and a grazing food chain. So let's start at trophic level 1. Now, trophic level 1 will always be the primary producer. Now, the primary producer, the easiest ones to remember are anything that can photosynthesize, but also decomposers play a primary producer role as well. Decomposers, or things that are decomposing, are often a leaf or things like that have had energy in the past. The second trophic level is always a primary consumer if it is feeding on a producer that has photosynthesized, or a primary decomposer if it is feeding on a dead organism. Okay, so dead leaves, dead animal. So in this case, crickets feed on leaves, leaves photosynthesize, whereas bacteria feed on dead leaves or dead organisms, so they are the primary decomposer. Okay? Then we have the secondary consumer. Now that secondary consumer will consume, will hunt, will eat the primary consumer. Okay? Very simple. The fourth trophic level is the tertiary consumer. Okay, and that will eat the secondary consumer or hunt the secondary consumer, and you can see there a quaternary consumer in the decomposer food chain, all right, is actually in the fifth level for that food chain, but the fourth level in the grazing food chain. It just depends what chain you are looking at, okay? So things to remember from here, guys. Trophic levels are a new word, and that's just the level at which the organism is occupying. Okay, some feeding strategies. Are they the primary consumer, the secondary consumer, the tertiary consumer? Or if you're doing a particularly long chain, the quaternary consumer? Or are they the ones that photosynthesize and create the energy, the primary producer? Okay. So, some more words to throw at you. I've just described some of them. So that trophic level is the what? You should be able to tell me now. The producer is a what? And a consumer is a what? If you'd like to practice and pause the video, write those words down and see if you're right. So, the trophic level, producer and consumer. The trophic level, in this case the third, is the level at which these two organisms occupy. They are secondary consumers. The producers carry out photosynthesis, okay, to produce energy. And finally, the consumers eat either the producer, so if they're a primary consumer, they will eat the primary producer. If they're a primary consumer, they are often a herbivore because they're eating plants, because plants photosynthesize. However, if you're a secondary, tertiary, or quaternary consumer, you're often a predator. Okay? You're often a predator or a parasite or some other form of consumer. Okay? So, with consumers, you've got to think about what they're eating. Are they herbivores or carnivores? Herbivores will be the primary consumers because they will eat the primary producer. But anything above them in the trophic levels will be our predators, okay, or our parasites or our carnivores. So, a food web. Here's another opportunity for you to show your knowledge. Pause the video. I want you to see if you can tell me what reason that I have for pointing the arrows in this direction. Is it A, that the cricket is going to eat the alligator lizard? Or is it B, that the earthworm, when eaten by the robin, transfers its energy to the robin? Think you got the right answer? Here it is. The arrows show the direction of energy flow from the organism consumed to the consumer. And the key thing to remember, guys, is the original energy comes from the sun. Okay, so there we have it. The difference between food chains and food webs, you should be able to tell me all about them now. So, I want you to go back to your Hyperdoc and feedback on the key questions that are there. Catch you in class, fellas.